Redditors who went out for cigarettes and never came back. Why did you leave? Where did you go? What is life like for you now? Serious. Story 1. Throwaway for good reason. I've always lived in an abusive house, both mentally and physically, and never saw a proper way out. I started working at 14 years old in a convenience store at $8 an hour and hid all my money I made in a locked container in a nearby wooded park area. I did this because my parents would have taken all the money if they knew that I was working at all. By the time I was 18, I had close to $10,000 saved up and had finished high school. I was supposed to start university that year, but early on in the summer, I waited until my parents were out of work and found and took all of my documents, enrolled out of the university program I was supposed to be in, and left. I took a bus to Alberta, and I've been living here since doing labor. It's been almost a year and a half, and they haven't searched for me yet. Not that I'm aware of, at least. How is my life now? I'm poor, barely getting by, but at least I'm living alone and happier than I was before. Story 2. Sort of. My cousin went out for a walk once. He was dating this woman who was just an awful human being. She got pregnant and swore it was his, and once the kid was born, the state went after him for child support, and he wasn't even on the birth certificate, even though they were living together. Anyway, the paternity test came back showing it wasn't his, and she flipped her lid. Just lost it. He asked her to calm down and said he wanted to take a walk to cool off. He left everything he owned, minus the clothes on his back, and his wallet. He went for a walk that he never came back from. A few years back, the kid found him. He was 16 or 17 and went on some giant rant about him being a bum and a punk ass or whatever other nonsense. My cousin told him he wasn't the father and abandoned him. The kid left a whole hell of a lot more confused than he showed up, I think. Story 3. I was living with a very mean and controlling girlfriend. If it wasn't her way or all about her, she just threw a fit. One day, I had enough and said that I was going to the store and just kept driving. I literally drove for 12 hours and showed up at a friend's house 5 states away and asked if I could crash on his couch. I called my boss and said I wanted to quit work. He was pretty cool about it. He knew my girlfriend and actually set me up with a job in my new city. I had never spoken to my ex since. Soon after my relocation, I met my now wife, and I could not be in a better relationship. Best thing I ever did. Story 4. Just failed out of college, moved back in with my dad, and things weren't really going well between us. I was depressed and not really going anywhere. I was angry at my dad because he came down on me so hard, but I was mostly angry at myself. And his attitude toward me just kind of compounded it all. Anyway, one day after being at a friend's house and hanging out all over the city for a couple of days, I finally came home. Things around the house were just tense, and I felt like nothing. And like I would never get out from under his weight. So I just started packing some stuff. As I was leaving, I remember coming out of my room with a bag. This wasn't unusual because I would often take a bag with me when I'd be going to a friend's house, but today my dad was standing at the top of the steps and just looked down at me. I remember very vividly him just standing there with his hands in his pockets, just looking at me, and then me looking away, and he quietly just asked, "Where are you going, son?" I just looked up like everything was normal and just said, "I'm going to some friends and acquaintances' house." He nodded slowly. "When are you coming back?" I shrugged slowly. "I don't know, Dad." Somehow, he knew. I could feel it. I never came back home. Days turned into weeks and months and then years. I could tell he knew. It makes me so sad now when I think of it, like I tore his heart in two. He had never been a very expressive man, but I could tell just how sad he was. I needed this, though. I needed to go off on my own and suffer the real world and grow up some. It still hurts my heart to think about him slowly nodding after I told him, "I don't know, Dad." I've been in contact with my dad since I left, and things are pretty good. I left during a time when cell phones were not popular, and I spent a lot of the time on the streets at first, with the only thing I owned being a car that I kind of lived out of. Eventually, a good friend of mine had his family take me in, and I spent years helping their family while searching for what to do. During this time, I would periodically just speak to my dad and stepmom and mom and stepdad on the phone every few months. They knew I was alive and well. My dad really never brought up the fact that I'd left and would just make sure I was doing alright. We just don't have a relationship where we express much. I think he understood as time went on. See, he has this idea of how I should have progressed through life. I wasn't good at his plan. I was too immature. I did not leave because I was unhappy with him and what he provided me, but more so that I couldn't stand shoulder to shoulder with him and make my own success. I just wasn't who he expected me to be, and it took a lot of growing away from him just for us both to understand that. After a few years, I went to visit him in his office, and it turns out that he had bought me a cell phone. It was my first. It was enough of a sentiment for me to understand that he really understood what I needed. He just wanted to talk to me occasionally. I tell my dad I love him every time we talk. We live in the same town, so I often visit him and my stepmom with my girlfriend when I can. They love her more than me. Story 5. One night I just packed the essentials into my backpack, walked into a train station, and got on a train to Newport News, Virginia from Pasco, Washington. No one knew I was gone until 3 a.m. the next morning. It was to be with a girl my family was totally 100% against. That was a year ago, and it's all working out perfectly. I'm happier now than I ever have been before. Story 6, kinda late, but I'll share my story. I grew up in a foster care, and all the homes that I lived in were either abusive or run in a business collecting cash to house kids format. My actual mom was a very heavy drinker and was abusive, hence me being in foster care. As an adult, we had a very good relationship. She was proud of me, impressed with my work ethic, and amazed that I had gotten a fully paid education via scholarships at the state university. Everything was going swimmingly until I started to do better than my immediate family. They started to think I had abandoned them and that I was too good for them once I started pursuing my education. The last conversation I had with my mother and sisters occurs on Thanksgiving 2011, when I drove 3 hours to sit down and have our first legitimate family dinner in several years. I showed up, my mom was drunk, and my sisters were incoherently intoxicated on narcotics. My sister yelled at me for abandoning my family and called me unforgivable things. My mom said to me, "I hope you achieved all your dreams. Lord knows you had to abandon ours." I got up from dinner and left. I spent the entire drive back home for 3 hours hysterically sobbing. I haven't talked with them since. I know it was bitterness and the drugs talking, but it really did shatter me to the core. My mother passed away this year, and that dinner was the last time I ever saw her or spoke to her. Both of my sisters were incarcerated at the time, so I flew home to clear out her estate. She didn't have anything but a mountain of bills and a house full of items to sort through. I donated almost all of it to Goodwill. While sifting through her belongings, I did find a lockbox, though. The lockbox contained her wedding ring from my late father and some photos of my sisters and me as kids, perfectly preserved. It also had a single note inside, which was addressed to all three of us, with corresponding paragraphs dedicated to us. My paragraph said, "Daniel, words cannot describe how sorry I am and how much I have hurt you. It's eaten at me every day for the last 10 years. I drink because I wish I could have been the mother you deserved. You were the strongest man I have ever met. I'm sorry. You deserve so much more than I gave you. I love you with all my heart. I hope someday you can forgive me. Mom." It destroys me inside to know that my mom died thinking that she didn't mean the world to me. If I'm being honest, I started drinking very heavily after she passed. She died thinking I didn't love her with all of my heart. I carry her driver's license in my wallet, above mine, so that every time I take it out, I get to see her. But more importantly, she can see me and know that I'm always right here. I just went on a bender when she died, but I do have my life put back together almost a year later. Unfortunately, my sisters and I aren't on speaking terms. As cliche as it sounds, they still resent me. Although I still reach out to them and let them know that the door is always open. Hopefully when they get older, we'll be able to have a relationship. I understand where they're coming from, and although I disagree, I'm not bitter or angry at them. Story 7. I did this basically. Told my parents that I was going for a hike in the woods for a few days, but instead took a flight to Europe and joined the French Foreign Legion. They figured I was dead for a few weeks, but eventually they figured out what I had actually done. It's been almost 2 years and I'd still rather not see them ever again, but one of these days I'm gonna have to go back and see all my younger brothers who still live there. As for why, it's a long story. I didn't have the greatest childhood. Basically, I just decided that I had nothing better to do and life was boring as hell, so I might as well do something stupid or crazy. So I just left and never looked back. Whether or not I'm better off now than I was before is debatable, but at least I can say I've done something with my short little life. My parents were/are religious fanatics and complete narcissists with their own special brand of Christianity. They homeschooled me my entire life until I was 17, at which point they kicked me out due to religious disagreements. I managed to survive for around half a year myself. Unfortunately, I was kinda lacking in the life skills department. Basically, until I left at 17, I never had any friends, never left the house without my parents, and had no diploma or any other record of me doing school. I also found myself lost without someone yelling at me all the time and telling me what to do. So I figured I would just join the military. Just do as I'm told, not have to worry about bills or food or anything. Perfect. Unfortunately, my national army just told me to wait 2 years and I have no patience at all, so my next logical step was to join the FFL. So I didn't last long by myself and I ended up coming crawling back to them and staying with them until I turned 18. But I wasn't idle. I saved up money, stole all my documents from the lockbox where they kept them, and bought a plane ticket. And here I am now, halfway across the world, speaking a different language and protecting different people. Story 8. I left my abusive husband 7 years ago. I just walked out the door and I never spoke to him again. I had squirreled away money for years because he controlled my income. He had this idea that I was miserable because we didn't have any children, so he tried to change that by me so I could get pregnant. He didn't know I was using birth control. I had resigned from my job, so I just left. I couldn't bring children into that life. I went to live with my parents in a different part of the country. Now I live in a different country. I have a kind and loving partner, and we have a daughter. I'm happy most of the time. My family doesn't tell people where I live in case he should find out. I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's dead. Story 9. American that moved to Australia for 2 years, got a girl pregnant, fell in love, and saw her for the horrible person that she really was, but stuck it out. After the baby was born, I had to be sure he was mine. The test came back showing no parental match. I confronted her. We fought and she swore up and down that it was a bad test. Wanting to believe it, I scheduled another test for the three of us to go to. $800 later, 2 days before the test, she played dumb and said she never agreed to that. Told me to get out of their life and that her child was not a science experiment. I stayed with a friend for a couple of days and then came back. She acted like nothing happened and just wanted to move on. Another test was no longer an option in her book. It was the hardest decision of my entire life, and it still makes me sick to think about a week later I scheduled a flight back to California. I've been back for 4 years now. We talked a bit over the years after I left, but it just went back to her wanting to fight. After some antidepressants and heavy drinking, I'm finally starting to feel whole again. I look at the world very differently now. Story 10. My parents were split and hated each other and would always put me in the middle. The drugs and alcohol they were both doing didn't help. Got kicked out of each of their places and went back and forth over some shitty circumstances involving them wanting all of my money to live with them. Then playing the guilt card on each other that they took me in when the other kicked me out. I got a steady retail job that I had to work 6 to 7 days a week at odd hours to get full time. 2 weeks before Christmas, Mom said her place wasn't a truck stop and I couldn't come and go at all hours of the night and said I had to leave. Heard similar from her before and didn't want to go to Dad's again, so I called some family and they all refused to take me because my mom had called and told them I hit her. Since I was still in the same house, I told her she was a horrible person and an even worse mother, and left. Grandma knew my parents were crazy, so she helped me as much as she could. Still getting phone calls /emails /Facebook messages asking me when I'm going to stop being such a bitch so we can be a family again. Have seen both since, invited my friends through Facebook to things they would have invited my parents to. Finally netted up and told them both to get the f*** out of my life. Mom still leaves me drunk /high /crying voicemails in the middle of night, either telling me that she loves me or that I'm all that's wrong with her life. Dad sends me emails telling me to get the stick out of my ass because I'm still his son. Still spend time with Grandma. Friends' parents mean more to me than my own ever did. Now I've got a full-time job and an awesome dog, working on doing better in my life in general and trying to move into a place solo. Blood is not thicker than water. Will never speak to either of them again if I can help it. No regrets. Story 11. Left my family close to 5 years ago to move to California to start a new life. I was 400 pounds, living a lifestyle of prescription drugs and drinking at 17 with my family. I was good in high school and even went to college early, but wasn't able to secure a loan there to continue past the first year. Dropped my shit life there and came here. It was a very tough time, but I'm a lot better now, and I had some help from my adopted father but paid my way aside from the ticket here. I live on my own now and manage an office selling printer parts and various other moneymakers online. I started my own business last year and have been paying out of my pocket to continue school here because the college I went to wouldn't release my transcript. I've lost a great deal of weight and I am away from any unhealthy addictions. My family is for the most part very close to me. My mother died 2 years ago. I'd planned to go to her birthday in 2013, but she died 2 weeks before it. The only regret I have is leaving that door open. I'd like to think she'd be proud of where I went. Story 12. Mom cornered me in the bathroom after chasing me around in the house and told me to punch her when I tried to leave, and punched me instead. I said I'd call the cops, and she said she would do the same as she's done with my ex-stepdad. Tell him I punched her and it'd be her word versus mine. The next morning I got into a broken Ford that was still in her name even though it was mine. Went to get the oil changed and told the guy how long he thinks the car could make it. He said I'd be lucky to make it around a block and that I wouldn't even go in reverse among other things. At the same time, I thought, I'm only going forward. 3 days later, I drove from California to Maryland and spent about 5 years without contact. Reconnected, foolishly thinking people change. People don't change. The last I heard from her, she wanted me to sign over my apartment in Russia so she could sell it and give me the money. I told her I'd happily sign it over, but she didn't need to pretend that she'd give me a dime. I've also been working since the age of 12, albeit for less than $8 an hour when I started. Only reconnected because I have sisters, but the brainwashing she's done against me is done. Both my sisters are so. One is pregnant at the age of 18, failing grades, and neither will take me up on my offers to help. I'm the pariah who left and traveled the world, but I'm a loser because, well, f this thread. F you, Mom. Story 13. Not the same thing, and there's another drama involved, but I want to keep it short. We went through a bad breakup. To get away from it, I went to Sri Lanka in 2004 during Christmas. The tsunami happened. Came back and told my family and about 2 friends I was leaving LA. Boarded a plane a few days later for New York with 2 bags, no apartment, and no job. Found a job in a flat within the first few weeks. I've been here 10 years now and have no regrets. Story 14. I was left. My dad and my mom fought, my dad left, and then he killed himself. On one hand, I have no memories of him because I was too young, and I was very sympathetic to mental illness and ideation. I have had bouts of serious depression in my life. On the other hand, his absence and the lack of dad made a huge gaping hole in my life. The strangest part is when I turned the age he was when he killed himself. I'm 36 and I'm older than my dad ever was, and I still feel young, like I have many years ahead of me. I wish I had the opportunity to know him. Everything I know about him is someone else's memory. Story 15. My father just walked out on us when I was 9 and walked out on everything. Racked up a load of debt before he went without my mother knowing, through a gambling habit that he had which we didn't know about until immediately after, and the hounding from people/companies that he'd borrowed money from. Some of them were the kind of people that he didn't want to owe money to, and the next few years were kinda rough. Add to that, my mother got sick around the same time and ended up unable to leave her bed for a few years. I think the illness was caused or at least exacerbated by the shock of his leaving. Not gonna lie, it was rough, and I ended up getting homeschooled as they were afraid that he'd show up and pick me up from school one day. And after a little while of that, my confidence was so drained that I avoided school as much as possible. Police were looking for him and eventually found him after a year or two in a town 200 miles away. He didn't want to get in contact with anyone, and nothing came of it. He was an ex-policeman, so I guess he knew what to say or something. Then a few years later, we got a phone call from a lady who had found his address book, informing us that he had died and she was looking for his next of kin. It was ended with us traveling to where he had been staying, only to find the elderly lady who was basically bleeding dry financially. Some of the stories he'd been spinning to manipulate people were incredible. People there thought of him as a hero. He told them about how he'd started a new life after nursing his sick wife with cancer until she passed away, how my brother had been inspired by his story and he was working as a doctor abroad, and in his fantasy, I had never actually existed. I can't really say I'm angry about it. I grew up afraid that I'd end up like him, but I think when you're exposed to something like that as a child, you can either see it as an example of how to live, or you can look at it and do everything in your power to avoid becoming it. Story 16. My mother left me at her door. I would visit every Saturday for a few hours and then she wasn't there. After 10 plus years of extreme hate towards her, my uncle enlightened me. He said, maybe she left you for the better. Turns out she had some extreme mental issues. Drug abuse. It's amazing how a few words can change your life.